Good evening, folks. Thanks for coming in. You're all very welcome. And it's start to another week and another week closer to the big man coming. The fat chap come down the chimney if you've got a chimney. Tonight we are joined again by our good friend, Top Hat Tours man, as I call him, Mr. Pendle. He's probably the UK's foremost authority on the Pendle Witch trials and everything associated with it. He's also the author of Ghostly Tales of the Unexpected, and he's got his own YouTube channel. Now I'm going to get this wrong, Simon. Tales of the Grave, is that right?
That's quite correct, Scott. There's a whole series of stories actually on YouTube called Tales from the Graves, and we cover some great stories.
And he's been on TV, radio, seminars. This guy's been everywhere. Mr. Simon Entwistle. Simon's back. It's been too long, young man. It's been too long since we last spoke to you, but I know you had surgery recently. You're still recovering for that, and everybody here wishes you well. So, how have you been? What's been happening?
Right. Well, I've been very, very busy with coach tours, Scott. As you quite rightly say, I am pretty busy with Pendle Witch tours in particular. And I take minibuses around all the villages in the Pendle region, and we cover the entire Pendle Witch story. But we also go to Lancaster City Castle and look at the courtrooms and indeed the well tower at the castle. I had the great pleasure of meeting Jonathan Ross quite recently on a Channel 5 show called Myths and Legends, where we actually went into the well tower, a place which is normally not really, it's out of bounds to the public, really. So it was nice to actually be allowed to go in there and have a look at the conditions these poor people were kept in way back in 1612.
I was watching, I can't remember who it was. It was a woman that was on, and she was looking down, and actually she got access to the dungeons where they were held, and it shows you getting down the stairs and stuff like that. And it was pretty grim, even for this day and age, just looking into it. But you try to imagine what it was like back in 1612, because there was quite a few of them crammed in to, these cells, men, women, sort of thing. And it must have been pretty horrific for them. And I think they were there a couple of months, is that right?
From April to August, Scott, really. They say they weren't tortured, but let's be honest, being chained to the floor in total darkness on a starvation diet, to me, really is torture. There's no two ways about it, really. It would have been, as you say, Scott, very grim.
Yes. One thing, we've had you on the show quite a few times, Simon, and I don't know if I've ever asked you this, but I'm going to ask you tonight. As you know, we've covered Pendle, with shows and posts, and we've been there ourselves.
Yeah.
One thing that's always stuck in my head is Tyndale Farm. Now, I've watched a couple of TV shows, I'm not going to name them, but they always feature Tyndale Farm as part of the Pendle Witch story, etc. And, for what we found out, Tyndale Farm didn't exist back in 1612. Can you tell me what where the connection is? If there is one.
It's because it's very, very near the village of Blackhoe, which is in the very, very centre of the story, Scott. There's no two ways about it. But Tyndale Farm would not have actually existed at that period of time. We're looking at very, very early 19th century, but it's certainly very much in the centre of the Pendle Witch story. The only buildings we have got left from the Pendle Witch trials will be the home of Alice Nutter, a place called Ruffley Hall. We have the home of Jeanette Preston in Gisborne, which is still there to this very day. In fact, it's up for sale, would you believe? Lancaster City Castle, of course, and indeed none other than Samlesbury Hall, where the Samlesbury Hall witches were brought in at the same time. We're looking at very, very early 17th century here, so there's not much left from that period of time. You've got to really use your imagination. And of course, you've got to rely entirely on a book called The Wonderful Discovery of Witches in Lancashire by Thomas Potts, who was indeed the clerk to the courts at that period of time. It's the only eyewitness account we've got. It does seem to be slightly biased towards women from having read it, but it is indeed the only eyewitness account we've actually got on the trial. So we have to believe it as being honest and very truthful.
Mm-hmm. What the other thing, it's a paranormal thing. Just before I come to that, when Sarah and I visited Pendle, I think it's 2 years ago now, 3 years ago. I can't remember. It's a caravan, a camping site, or something head. I can't remember the name of it. But we stayed there and we toured Pendle. Didn't realise it was a blooming big. Of course, when you watch, the Pendle story, you imagine it to be kind of clumped together. But we visited New Church, Sadler's Farm and what have you. Just the atmosphere at St Mary's Church in which just, I think it's a place you need to go to. You can't describe the atmosphere. And also Bill House Farm as well, but we couldn't get down it because, it's private property. Somebody's living there.
Yes.
But it was the only complaint I've got about Pendle, right? It's going to sound daft, but is the roads.
Oh yeah,
around the place.
Yeah,
the hedges are that high. I don't know if it's any different now, but hedges and the roads are that wide. And I'm surmising there's been a few narrow misses on the roads over time.
Oh yes,
but
it's a very awkward place to take coaches into, I must say, Scott. So I tend to take minibuses, but even with a minibus, I should say those roads are very, very tight. And if you need a milk tanker, or indeed a farm vehicle, you're in trouble, really.
If you come up against one of them, you are in bothers or Laura saying, hello, Doc. So the question, we guessed on last week, and we were talking about, doing paranormal investigations, how some days they encounter spirits that didn't want to talk to women. And so I says to them, do you think, back, I say, see if you get a spirit for the 1600s, obviously back then, women were to be seen and not heard, basically, sort of thing, they weren't allowed a voice. And I kind of thought, well, if you get a spirit for the 1600s and he doesn't want to talk to a woman, is that maybe because of, how they lived their life, how they were brought up back then? Does that make sense? I know what I'm talking about up here. But when I was talking about it last week, I thought, I've got Simon on next week. I need to ask him, obviously because of the Pendle Witch trials and what have you, about the women not having a voice, etc. Do you think that they can still hold on to that kind of attitude?
Very much so, Scott, really. Thomas Potts, he was the clerk of the courts at Lancaster, and he wrote this book. It was all in old English, if you will, very hard to follow. And recently, a gentleman called Robert Poole, he's completely deciphered the book and made it a lot more easy to read by putting it to plain English text, really. But there's no two ways about it. At that period of time, women were treated very, very badly, almost like second-class citizens, really. They had no rights whatsoever. And we do know that Potts, when he wrote the book, a lot of the royalties went to a gentleman called Thomas Cavett. And apparently Cavett was the man who stopped the gunpowder plot. He actually stopped Guy Fawkes from lighting the blue touch paper. So there's no two ways about it. Potts would have been very, very loyal to the king. And he made it very clear there was no defence counsel whatsoever. And in many ways, these people were found guilty before they even arrived in Lancaster.
Their fate was kind of sealed, I think. With Alice Nutter, I think she was the exception, but if I remember right, she was originally there over a land dispute against Roger Knowles, which she won, and obviously this was unheard of, and that day, not just a woman being in court with a voice, but winning the case against, Roger Knowles, who was quite a prominent gentleman in the area, and obviously was the judge that presided over the trial. Do you think that sealed her fate, her winning that dispute?
I think she really embarrassed him. And of course, in those days, women were classed as second-class citizens. And the fact that she had won the land dispute fairly and squarely, But he had a trump card up his sleeve, and that trump card was the youngest of the Devise children, a little girl called Jeanette Devise, whilst her grandmother Elizabeth Southern, her mother Elizabeth Devise, her brother James Devise, and sister Alison Devise had been sent to Lancaster. She had been sent to live with the local magistrate, Roger Nowell. And to use a modern term, we think that she was probably groomed by him into creating stories which incriminated her entire family. She mentioned various dogs called familiars, dogs called Tib, Bull, Fancy, and Dandy, that gave them special powers. What we do find amazing is that when these so-called witches were arrested, the dogs just disappeared. Could they just been a figment of Potts's imagination? It's hard to say, really.
Well, I know this day and age you get stray dogs and cats, kicking about, what have you. Maybe it was a stray cat or a dog kind of thing. But tonight you've got some Christmas stories for us lined up. But I do, before we go into them, Simon, by the way, I do love the tree in the background. Very festive indeed. How long's your tree been up? I need to ask you this. I was talking to Ian Paranormal last week about when's it suitable to put decorations up. When did you put your tree up?
Would you believe, Scott, today I've done it specially for the programme.
Oh, thank you very much, Simon.
Yes,
thank you.
It's just been put up today, but the tree actually does live in my garden in a rather large pot, and we bring it in every year. So this is its fourth year, I think, really. And as you can see, it looks quite nice, really. But what I love about Christmas, really, Scott, is ghost stories at Christmas are quite fantastic. And of course, you've got that brilliant Charles Dickens and the Christmas Carol, which has got to be one of the finest ghost stories anyone could read, really. But I do conduct a variety of ghost walks and have done for the past 35 years. And I find the best way to get a good story is to talk to an eyewitness. And the story you're about to hear is quite a beautiful story, really, and a very, very true story. Way back in 1996, I put an ad in the local newspaper for anyone that could come forward with a genuine ghost sighting. In other words, an eyewitness. One such person arrived at my home. He was called Billy Lakin, and I made him a cup of coffee. He sat down in this very room, this very conservatory, and he reached into his pocket and brought out a photograph of 37 young men outside St. Mary's Parish Church Centre in Clitheroe. On the back of the photograph was everyone's name and the words Clitheroe Territorial Army, September 1939. And this is, of course, when Great Britain and the Commonwealth declared war on Nazi Germany. He said the photograph was taken. We got our kit bags and our equipment and made our way down to the railway station and found ourselves going across the English Channel to France, where we were sent to a place called the Maginot Line, French fortifications. The French told them, don't worry, boys, the Germans will never, ever get through here. This is the safest defence in the whole of Europe. For 10 months, Bill and the Clitheroe platoon would march up and down the Maginot Line with nothing. It was called the Cold War, the phony war, but this all changed on the 10th of May, 1940, when the Germans launched what we call Blitzkrieg, lightning war. Well, the French were quite right. The Germans didn't bother attacking the Maginot Line. They came round the back of it. Bill remembered that day very, very well. His officer said, right, boys, we're going to Dunkirk. He said it wasn't exactly a march to Dunkirk, it was a run. And for 6 days, without food, very little water, they ran all the way from the Maginot Line to the French port of Dunkirk. When he got to Dunkirk, there was deep smoke billowing in from the oil tankers right down the length of the beach, and the whole of the town was on fire. He got to the sand dunes of Dunkirk, and all he could see were thousands and thousands of British Tommies. He was exhausted. He took his tin helmet off and used it to dig a hole in the side of a sand dune. He climbed into the sand dune and fell into a deep sleep, the first sleep inside 55 hours. Whilst he was sleeping, the German Air Force strafed the beaches. He was woken by his corporal some 8 hours later, and the corporal said, "Hey, Bill, it's our turn to be evacuated. The Royal Navy have organised an evacuation from Dover called Operation Dynamo. It's our turn to be taken off the beaches at 4 o'clock this afternoon." Billy remembered making his way down to the beach at Dunkirk. He kept his rifle above his head to keep the working parts out of the salt water, when a German aircraft came down the beach and opened fire. He dived under the water. When he came to the surface, the sea was red, crimson red, with the blood of his mates. He felt a hand grab his battle dress jacket. He was pulled into a small rowing boat by a Royal Naval rating, and with other men on board the rowing boat, rowed out to a Royal Naval destroyer, where he received the finest meal he had ever had in his life. The first food in 7 days. It was a corned beef sandwich and a mug of tea. He got to Dover, and at Dover he looked for his mates but couldn't find anyone. An officer intervened. "Look, we know where you've come from. You don't need any money at all, just getting the first train back to your battalion headquarters." In his case, it was indeed St Mary's Parish Church office in Clitheroe. He went from Dover to London, London to Preston, and then Preston to Clitheroe. When the train got into Clitheroe station in the early evening, he kissed the railway platform. He was so delighted to get back home again. He then limped, and when I mentioned limped, he said his feet were so sore and so swollen from having to run from the Maginot Line to Dunkirk that he'd nearly worn the leather off the soles of his boots. He finally got to St Mary's Parish Church office and opened the door. Out of those 37 men on the photograph, only 14 had got back. The rest had been killed or indeed captured. They were told there and then to make up the numbers. And in those days, if you were 18, you were conscripted. If you were 17 years old, you could join up, but you had to have your mother and father's consent. Now, Billy was 19. He had a young friend who was 17. And this young boy said, "Oh, Bill, go and see me mum and dad. I want to fight for my country." Bill said to this young boy's parents, they said, "Sorry, he's only 17. The war could be over next year anyway." The boy persisted. "Oh, please, mum, please, dad, please sign the consent form. I want to fight for my country." They gave in on one condition, that condition being that Billy would look after him like a brother, and he swore he would do to both parents. They then did their military training and were sent to the beautiful Greek island of Crete, where on the 21st of May 1941, they joined the Anzacs, the Australian and New Zealand defenders, and were attacked by a highly disciplined airborne invasion of Fallschirmjäger, German crack paratroopers and glider-borne infantry. The fighting in Crete was absolutely ferocious. The Anzacs, particularly the New Zealanders, nearly turned it around, but the Germans had total air cover, and they really used the very cream of their armed forces. They took the island. In the fighting, the platoon lost over 18 men killed, one of them being the 17-year-old young boy. Bill was absolutely heartbroken at the death of this young lad and blamed himself entirely. From his POW camp in Poland, he would write for the Red Cross this young boy's parents, just simply begging their forgiveness. They did forgive him, but Billy never ever forgave himself. When he was repatriated in 1945, he was never the same man. Never smiled, didn't laugh, didn't talk to people. He was carrying a lot of guilt. However, on the 24th of December, 1968, Christmas Eve, he made his way to the parish church hall, where the photograph was taken all those years ago, to watch the Clitheroe Amateur Operatic Society's Christmas play. He was the very, very first person to leave the building. He stood outside and lit a cigarette. As he smoked the cigarette, he thought of those 37 young men, and particularly the young boy who had lost his life on Crete in 1941. He extinguished the cigarette and walked in front of the building, and then made a turn to the left, which would take him down a Snickleway, a ginnel that would take him down to a place called York Street. As he made his way down the ginnel, through the cobblestones, he heard a whisper, "Hey, Bill! Hey, Bill! Hey, Billy!" He turned round and saw the ghost of the young lad in British Army uniform He hadn't aged a day. He looked exactly as he had done on Crete in 1941. The boy rose his arm. Bill, don't you worry about me, Bill. I'm fine. I've always been fine, Bill. Don't worry about me. With that, Billy's knees gave way. He knelt on the cobblestones in that Snickleway, that Christmas Eve in 1968, and in his own words, he bellowed like a wounded animal. The tears streamed down his cheeks. He almost yelped in pain. As he looked up, the boy turned, smiled, and vaporized. It took Bill 30 minutes to get to his feet. He was severely traumatized. He walked home that night past the happy Christmas revelers. The last thing he felt was celebrating anything. He'd seen something very, very paranormal. He finally got home and climbed into bed, and quite surprisingly, had the best night's sleep he'd had in years. Christmas morning, 1968, he was woken by the bells of St. Mary's, the bells of St. James, and indeed the bells of St. Peter. He got out of bed feeling totally different. He made his way to the bathroom and opened the bathroom door and caught his reflection in the shaving mirror. He looked again and again and saw a change in his facial appearance. He noted for the first time since 1941, he was actually smiling, and he felt he'd been truly forgiven for the death of this young boy on Crete in 1941. I will never forget Bill's words as he left my house that day. He said, "Simon, I never believed in ghosts until I saw one with my own eyes." And there's Billy's words, not mine. Billy died a good 20 years ago because I knew him. I went to his funeral. I went to the interment at the cemetery, and there by the graveside were two very elderly gentlemen. And I had a diplomatic word with both of them. And I mentioned the young boy, and they said, "Oh, yes. Billy was looking after him that day. But as the German paratroopers got to our position, Billy sent him back to the ammunition truck, which had a metal tailgate, and told him to hide behind the tailgate. But as he left the split trench, he was hit by a German sniper." Of course, every November we buy poppies. And I always think of those two boys whose only crime in life really was to be born at the wrong time of the last century. And there, Scott, we have a real Christmas ghost story.
It's an amazing story. Just when you were telling it, you were saying he was under the water, you get pulled back up. It made me think, I think you see the film Saving Private Ryan with Tom Hanks, the start of it, when they're trying going to the beach and what have you, and it's a good, 10-15 minute scene. And that's what it reminded me of, because obviously a lot of them ended up in the water then, and even being in the water, you weren't safe, as you see, as you see. But as you say, this gentleman, God rest him, he said he never believed in ghosts until he seen it. A lot of people are like that, but they have to see it or experience it for themselves. You know what I mean? I've been asked quite a few times, "Have you ever seen a ghost?" And I said, "Well, I think so." I've got two answers for it. Actually, it sounds nuts. One night we were doing Loud and Kirk, and I get the briefest millisecond glimpse of a wee girl peeking her head out from behind trees kind of thing, but it was like that and gone. And then, other people say, "Have you ever seen a ghost?" I say, "Well, I don't know, because what does a ghost look like?" There's that many different stories, images, they see through, so you could be walking next to a spirit, you don't know anything about it, But as you see, so a lot of Christmas stories, they tend to get better at Christmas. Ghost stories, tend to get better at Christmas time.
Yeah.
And one story I always remember when I was a kid was the little match girl. I don't know if you've ever heard the one about the little match girl.
No, that's new to me, Scott. Definitely.
It was it was a book I had. One of these books your parents buy you as a kid, and it's got all these different big stories in it and coloured pages. And there was about a little girl who was poor. It was quite a long story, but I cut it down very, very short. Just this little girl, she was an orphan. and our only way of making money was to sell matches. And it was Christmas time, funnily enough, and she was out in the street. You know, she'd been there for days trying to sell matches. Everybody was ignoring her, basically. And then Christmas Eve, she was doing that again, trying to sell and trying to make some money. And this, her gran came to her gran had passed away many years before, and her gran came and held out her hand and says, you know, come with me, you know, I'll take you for a walk and what have you. And so she went for a walk with her gran. But her body was found the next day, huddled in the same spot, you know, for where she'd been trying to sell her matches. It's a longer story, but it's just one that always stuck with me as a kid, the little match girl. I don't know why. It's quite a sad story. Which is Charles Dickens, you know. I don't think anybody can top him with Scrooge. No. Scrooge, what? But just quietly getting back to yourself to see, you know, you don't believe in ghosts till you see one. You've been in Pendle for many, many years. I'm not going to give away your age, but it's a good while. You know, basically your whole life it centres around Pendle, and you've been to every different area possible. Have you ever seen anything in Pendle? I mean, I've read, you know, you read these stories on Facebook and stuff like that about people going to investigate the witches, which is something else I was wanting to ask you about. You know, I don't know if it's just me, but it annoys me that they're still termed as the witches because they weren't witches. You know, we know now that they were all, in fact, and I dare say one or two had dabbled in maybe stuff they shouldn't have, you know, but they're still termed to this day as witches. And that, I don't know, that kind of annoys me for some strange reason. What's your thoughts on that?
Way back in 2012, we had the 400th anniversary. And I do know that there was a petition to get the Pendle Witches pardoned, and 12,000 signatures I signed as well. And this was sent to the Home Secretary in London, a chap called Jack Straw, Labour Party. And we got a very, very nasty letter back saying, these people are enemies of the state, as found guilty by King James's courts, 12th of August, 1612, Lancaster City Castle, enemies of the state. At the same time, I was very, very kindly invited to see a statue being unveiled of Alice Nutter in her village of Roughly. And lottery money was used to pay for the statue, but the statue has become very, very much a symbol of female rights. And it's quite common, particularly in the summer months, to see bunches of flowers around the base of the statue. And I put Alice in the same league as the fabulous Emmeline Pankhurst, the great suffragette, the brilliant Edith Cavell, who was a fabulous World War I nurse who was shot by the Germans at dawn for helping Allied prisoners escape, and the great Grace Darling, who off Bamborough Head rowed out to a stricken ship in appalling conditions. Alice, I would put in the same league as them. A woman who was falsely convicted, but sadly, a woman who had a brain she wasn't allowed to use, and that did in fact affect her life.
I think that's why Alice Nutter, as you said earlier, sticks out, because one, she was there in court for an entirely different reason, you know, initially, and she came from a whole different kind of background. You know, no offence to the other ones, but she came from, you know, a whole different kind of background. But I've seen the statue many, many times, and am I right in saying that it faces away from Lancaster Castle and as a kind of act of defiance that she's walking away from it?
Yes, her back is facing Lancaster. She's in chains, and the artist David Palmer, who designed the statue, he has put a face of real innocence. It's almost as if she's walking to the gallows as an innocent woman, and she knows she's innocent, and that's what makes the statue quite sad, really.
As I was saying, you know, many teams been down there. We didn't investigate because we were on holiday with the little one way, so we weren't going to do any investigation. But I've heard so many teams going down and they'll investigate, like Newchurch, etc. So St Bartholomew's, I think it is, and other locations, and they'll say, "Oh, we picked up in the spirit of, you know, Elizabeth Demdike or Alice, you know, they'll name one or two. Have you ever experienced anything in all your time going around all the different areas and stuff?
I do like, shall I say, heritage tours, which just cover in the history. But I do get hired by various paranormal organisations like Haunted Happenings, Dusk Till Dawn, Bump in the Night, and also Shadow Explorers, etc. And I've done quite a few tours with Haunted Happenings, and we go to the Malkin Tower area. Now, no one can guarantee that Malkin Tower is the exact location in Blacko, but it's certainly that area. And I do remember going there some time ago, and they brought a medium, a marvellous chap called Kevin, and Kevin Bruff. And Kevin seemed to get into contact with the spirits there. But also this beautiful aroma came from nowhere. It was like walking to a flower shop. It was like a beautiful, sweet, sweet scent. And this was the middle of January, which is, there'll be no flora or fauna available for that period of time. But Kevin is a very talented lad, actually. In fact, he should really go on your show. But he also picked up on some of the Allied air crews that have been killed on Pendle Hill way back in World War II. There were 3 crashes, de Havilland Mosquito, a Lockheed Lightning, and indeed a Conciliated Liberator, Royal Canadian Air Force. And some 23 lads got killed on Pendle Hill. And Kevin wouldn't have known this. I did. But he picked up on 2 of the spirits, and he even got the names as well, which I find quite amazing.
It's when they get it's when they produce names and stuff, then you start to think,
yeah.
I mean, there is a lot of people out there that say well, I'm a medium, etc., etc.
Yes.
But it's when they pick out sort of names and places that nobody could, possibly know. How's Michael doing?
Michael's smashing lad. What a nice lad. Michael, I would say, was a real Pendle Witch expert. He actually organises what's called guided paranormal walks in Pendle. And he's just a young lad, a very nimble lad, actually. Wish I could do the same thing myself, but walking...
You're still a young chap yourself, Simon. You don't need to hang up your fishing rod yet, your top hat,
But certainly Michael organised these guided walks, and they are very good. And what a nice lad to talk to as well.
As he's contacted us a few times about, if we're any further on with the location at Malcolm Tower. I think we spoke about this before, Simon.
Yes, that's right.
And Laura looked into this a while back. Sarah found old maps and stuff like that, and we kind of came to the conclusion that it had to be round about the village of Colne.
Quite possibly, but I certainly wouldn't disagree with that. I really wouldn't. But it's a bit like a football field, isn't it, really? You've got all these villages close, compact together. And some people think that New Church in Pendle, some say Blacko, some say Colne. It's really hard to say, to be honest with you, because sadly there wasn't an exact marker that's gone back in history for that, really.
Actually, the thing that led us to believe is because it does tell us, the story tells us that it took John Law to the nearest inn or pub, whatever it was called back then, in the village of Colne.
That's right, quite true. Yeah.
So we were thinking, well, if that was the nearest village and he's met young, I'm going to say Alice, that's terrible, isn't it? It was Alice he met on the road to Trodden Ford, is that right?
That's quite correct. Alice and
I always get Alice and Jeanette mixed up. I don't know why.
Yeah. Certainly from the same family, that's for sure. From the same family.
I get they two mixed up. It was young Alice. And so I started thinking, well, a child surely, obviously I don't know how their mindset was way back in 1600, but a child surely wouldn't wander far from home, So if it was found at the edge of the forest in the nearest village with Colne, then it makes kind of sense that it's odd, just theory, mind you, Simon, because I know for many, many years people have been hunting for the
Oh
where
yes.
Malcolm Tower was, and I believe you were contacted some years back by a group who were convinced they'd found it. You know, something to do with found a black cat or something in the wall.
Yeah, way back in 2012. Yeah, it was 2012. I got a call from United Utilities, the water authority, and they've been working on a dam in the Blacko region. And they saw a rocky knoll behind it, and they thought, let's have an investigatory dig. And they thought this is no work for water engineers, and they called in a team from Loughborough University. And the Loughborough students, they unearthed a beautiful old cottage. I was very, very kindly invited to look at it. When I actually went inside, it was like walking back in time. And I met the two university professors there. They had a Tupperware dish. And in the Tupperware dish was the skeleton of, they believe, two cats, actually. And they were found in a recess in the building.
Mm-hmm.
And this is typical of Pendle Witch folklore, to leave what's called a medieval spirit, a familiar, to ward off other familiars. And certainly here in the Ribble Valley where I live, it's quite common for builders to, shall we say, renovate old barns and come across these poor cats that have been placed in a recess and bricked up alive. Quite cruel, but in those days, of course, it would have been a good luck charm to have your building secured by a familiar spirit of a cat.
So it turned out it wasn't Malcolm Tower.
Well, we don't know. To be honest with you, we don't know. What I can tell you, Scott, is the land belonged to United Utilities Water Authority, and we had a press release, and within a matter of days, the Daily Mail were there, the Star were there, the Telegraph were there, and so was BBC National News. They arrived, and I gave a short chat in the car park of the Pendle Hotel on live BBC television. And but I did get a lot of flack because really no one does know the exact location of Malkin Tower. And what I did say is that the professors had carbon dated everything back to the 17th century, which means it would have stood at the time of the Pendle Witch trials. But who it belonged to, we'll never know, because there were no records that could definitely go back to that period of time.
It seems to be, you know, I think you spoke about this before, Simon. It seemed to be the jewel in the crown, finding Malcolm Tower, you know, even though it's over 400 years ago. And the Pendle Witch trials, I mean, there was many witch trials, you know, from north to south of the UK during that time, many famous witch trials. But Pendle seems to be the kind of, I don't want to use the word biggest one, it seems to be the most famous one of them all. And obviously it has its connection to the Salem witch trials, you know. It's along the same kind of lines. There was a child involved, etc. Why do you think the Pendle story has captured people's imagination? No offence to, you know, the other victims or the other tribes, but they seem to, Pendle just seems to have captured the imagination, and it still holds it to this day, as you know.
Very, very much so, Scott. I think really we got Potts's book, The Wonderful Discovery of Witches in Lancashire, to thank, really. But when you read the book and when you digest it all, it's almost like a Steven Spielberg thriller. You've got King James VI of Scotland, who became King James I of England, paranoid about witches. You've then got the local magistrate who knows this. And of course, the king has written a book called Demonology. And this is given to every magistrate in Great Britain to watch out for illegal Catholic gatherings. And caused all this hysteria and paranoia were indeed these poor people that lived in the forest of Pendle. And of course, the main witness is the youngest of the devised children. And she is going to incriminate her entire family. But for the first time in her life, she's been living with the local magistrate, and she's been having 3 meals a day, a lovely warm bed to sleep in, and nice clothes to wear. And after 4 months of this luxury, she's only too happy to incriminate her entire family. And that's exactly what she did do. But with them, of course, was Catherine Hewitt from Cone, Jeanette Preston from Gisborne, and indeed Alice Nutter from Roughly, and John and Jane Bulcott from Blacko. They were brought in later on. But she told the court that they'd all been at what's called the Good Friday meeting at Malkin Tower.
I was just going to ask you about the Good Friday meeting. Obviously, we know religion was a major thing back then, and it's every Sunday, Christmas, Easter, stuff like that. You were required back to be in church, and if you weren't in church, the questions were asked. Do you think we all know that the Good Friday meeting, they had the gathering at Malcolm Tower, etc. And do you think that was a kind of undoing the Good Friday?
Well, that's a very good question, really. It wouldn't have looked very, very good. But when you think of Elizabeth Device, her mother, Elizabeth Southern, commonly known as Demdike, she's been arrested. And her daughter, Alison, has been arrested. So she's got her mother and her daughter at Lancaster City Castle under arrest. And according to Potts's book, she organised the Good Friday meeting to bring in all these other so-called witches to gather at Malkin Tower. And according to Potts's book, The Wonderful Discovery, the whole idea of this meeting was to get a potion together to blow the gates of Lancaster City Castle open, murder Thomas Cavell, the governor, and rescue Demdike, Chattox, Redfern, and Alison Devise. But nothing happened. What did happen is word of the Good Friday meeting reached the ears of Roger Nowell, and he gave orders that every single person who had attended this meeting should be arrested immediately. And that's exactly what happened. Of course, he had the trump card up his sleeve, and that was indeed the little girl, Jeanette Devise. She was going to be his chief witness. What we do find a little bit sad about the whole story, really, which again would make a Spielberg film, is the little girl watched her family die on the pillory. She actually watched them strangled to death, along with these other poor unfortunate people. And as soon as they'd stopped twitching the pillory, Noel said, "Goodbye. But surely, sir, I'm going back to that warm house of yours, sir. A warm bed and nice clothes, sir. Goodbye." He'd used her. We know she did survive because 3 years later, the poor girl was rearrested on a charge of witchcraft. A young boy called Edmund Robinson said he'd been walking through the forest of Pendle and seen her commit acts of witchcraft. With her family reputation, this is taken seriously. She's sent to the City of London. The poor girl is stripped naked. They look for marks on her body. And then she's sent back to Lancaster, where the same thing happens again, then down to London. And after 2.5 years of going up and down the country, being looked at by practitioners and doctors for marks on her body, this young boy Robinson said, "Actually, I made it all up. I didn't see her do anything." So witchcraft, or the superstitions surrounding it, absolutely destroyed that young girl's life, but of course her entire family and those other poor unfortunate people in the forest of Pendle. We know that the circuit judges, James Altham, Edmund Bromley, were knighted. Roger Nowell was made the High Sheriff of Lancashire with a huge increase in wages. And Thomas Potts, and that's why we're here today, really, Scott, wrote his book, The Wonderful Discovery of Witches in Lancashire. As I mentioned before, it's the only eyewitness account we've got. But for all we know, this is my sheer speculation, all the offences against them may just have been fabricated. It's hard to say.
I think, the Pendle Witch trials happened for 3 reasons, and this is just my opinion. Obviously, you're the expert, but one was because of a little girl's fear, because obviously John Law collapsed. We know it was a stroke. She was scared of what could happen to her. 2, because of a man's ego, Roger Knowles, and 3 was to get rid of a land rival, basically, if that makes sense. I think that's why I think the trials happened. And witchcraft was just, as you know, Simon, it was the easiest thing to use back then. You could point to your sister and say, she's a witch, and that should be off.
Oh, yes.
You know,
Oh, yeah.
Anybody and everybody could be accused, which is just the way it was. But obviously, you're looking at the early 1700s, I think it was around about 1730, 1735 time, the trial started to fade out, because I think it was correct me if I'm wrong, my history might suck, I don't know. I think it was King Charles started to have doubts as to whether, you know, this witchcraft thing was a real thing and stuff like that. And I think that was the sort of downfall of the trials, is that right? They started to sort of fade out then. Society started to sort of sit up and think, right, well, wait a minute, maybe these people weren't doing that.
Yeah, you did mention Salem before, Scott, and America became independent in 1781, really. Became independent after the Brits had left. But before then, of course, they had the Salem witch trials, and they used the Pendle Witch trials as a template for the actual trial itself by, again, having a child witness. It was believed that a child could not be manipulated of that age. And, of course, the jury believed every word she said. And this little girl's word really condemned all those people to death.
And they're still remembered to this day. Well, just one last question, because we're going to move on another Christmas story. At the execution, when they were hung, you see the little one stand there, she's watching her family strangling to death, which would have been horrific in itself. And then, do you think maybe then it started to hit home exactly what she'd done? I'm not saying she was evil or anything like that. Obviously, she's a child. She's been corrupted by this, Roger Knowles, who had only one aim in mind. Do you think it maybe started to kind of dawn on her then, childlike, what had happened?
I think when she was discarded by Roger Knowles, it must have been very, very hurtful, because she thought she was probably going to go back to Reed Hall, Burnley, where he lived. But he just cast her aside. She'd done his dirty work for him, really. And, of course, he was going to curry favour with the King of England personally, which, of course, he did do. We can only presume that she made her way back to the Forest of Pendle and survived, because 3 years later she's rearrested on a charge of witchcraft. So she must have been a very tough girl, really, and she must have known how to survive. Who she stayed with, where she lived, we don't know. But we do know she was rearrested 3 years later in the Forest of Pendle.
And, of course, the Salisbury witches have got a close connection to the Pendle witches.
Very, very much so. That's a great story. Again, if Spielberg got his teeth into it, he'd have a Hollywood thriller. In the next cell to the Pendle witches were 3 young ladies, Jane Southworth, Jean and Ellen Brearley. Jean and Ellen are both identical twins. In fact, you couldn't tell any difference between them. They were very good friends of Jane Southworth, who lived at Salisbury Hall. Now, Jane was very privileged. She had 3 meals a day. She had servants, and she lived at Salisbury Hall. However, in April 1612, the King's Commission arrived at Salisbury Hall. "In the name of the King, we arrest you for witchcraft." Sir Richard said, "My daughter a witch? She can't be." Well, the 3 girls are shackled. They're taken downstairs, and they are sent to Lancaster City Castle to await trial. They are placed in the cell next door to the Well Tower. They never see the Pendle witches, but on the 20th of August 1612, they hear this huge roar outside the castle gates. Now, there's a small cell window, and Jane climbed up the shelves with 2 friends and looked out of the grille. There, to her horror, she saw the Pendle witches in a long line with their hands tied behind their backs, about to mount what we call the pillory, the gallows. As they climb into the gallows, Thomas Cabell, he's the head jailer at Lancaster City Castle, he kicks away the first trestle, and there's a huge roar that would have made Glasgow Celtic or Liverpool proud. Another trestle is kicked away. Now Jane is watching this, and her two friends, Jean and Ellen, shout, "Jane, what's happening?" Terrible things are happening. Terrible things are happening. And then there's silence. They then hear the sounds of footsteps that get louder and louder. A key is placed in the door. The door is opened, and there's Thomas Cavell. Jane Southworth recognizes immediately as the executioner of the Pendle Witches. "Right, you three. Just dealt with that lot. Your turn next." The three of them must have felt terrified, particularly Jane, as they enter the courtroom, and they stand in front of James Altham, City of London, Edmund Bromley, City of London, Thomas Pott, City of London, Roger Noel, local magistrate for the Forest of Pendle, William Holden, local magistrate for Burnley, and Nicholas Bannister, local magistrate for Barrow Ford. The jury are all male, and the prosecution is all male. These three young girls must have felt very, very exposed. They bring in another child witness, a little girl called Gracie Sowerberts. Gracie is 8 years old, and she is indeed the head gardener's daughter at Sarsby Hall. She too is picked up by Roger Noel and placed on top of the desk, like he did do with little Jeanette Devise in the morning for the Pendle Witch trials, so the jury can see her quite clearly. And James Altham said, "Right, young lady, read out your testimony against these three witches." "I will, sir. I was walking along the banks of the River Ribble, sir. It was a very hot summer's day. I saw Jane Southworth and the two Brearley twins, sir, from Sarsby Hall, swimming in the river. It was a hot day. I then saw these unusual dogs. I have never seen the breed before. Long snouts, long backs, cloven hooves, long tails, snarling red eyes and white teeth. They jumped into the River Ribble. They materialized into human beings, slightly dark-skinned human beings. They picked up all three girls. They danced in a circle. They paired off for a meal. I then watched from a distance as fraternization was taking place with these demonic spectres. On the second day, Ellen Brady came to see me. She said, 'Gracie, we'd like to have a bit of fun.' 'Fun? What fun?' 'A little boy has just been born at Sarsby Hall called Thomas Walshman. So he hasn't been christened. So we'd like to drink his blood.' 'No, no,' said Gracie. 'I don't want to get involved in that.' James Altham picked up the gavel. 'We find the three of you guilty. You shall die like the rest this morning.' Before the gavel came down, his companion, the other circuit judge in the City of London, Edmund Bromley, said, No. Let her finish her testimony.' Sir, in the dead of night, the three of them made their way to Sarsby Hall. They went to the long gallery where the little Walshman boy was sleeping, and they took him from his cot. They pricked his stomach, and they drank his blood. He died 4 days later and was interred at the local cemetery in Sarsby. Sir, in the dead of night, the three of them came back. They dug at the coffin, they took the child from the coffin, and they boiled his flesh. They ate the flesh but kept some body fats that would enable them to change shape. James Altham was furious. He picked the gavel. 'We find you guilty.' Before the gavel came down, James Southworth pulled off a miracle. 'Sir, I beg of you, sir, to cross-examine this young girl, sir. She has been deliberately manipulated by a Catholic priest to falsely incriminate me and my two friends, sir. Please cross-examine her.' That one word, Catholicism, made the judges sit. 'Are you an Anglican, you say?' 'Yes, sir, I'm an Anglican. I'm married to the Southworth family, so they're all Catholics, sir. This young girl has been deliberately manipulated to falsely incriminate me and my two friends, sir, by a Catholic priest hiding at Sarsby Hall, sir, called Thompson.' Well, the court was hushed. That word, Catholicism, was still echoing around the whole of the court. They took me to next door. Jane, Jean and Ellen waited. Would they join the Pendle Witches, or would they somehow be saved? After what seemed like an eternity, the court was reassembled. Edmund Bromley stood up. 'In the light of new evidence, we find you, Jane Southworth, you, Jean and Ellen Brearley, innocent of the crimes against you. You're free to go.' 'You're free to go.' The three of them jumped up and down with sheer delight. They hugged each other, and they made their way back to Salisbury Hall to a huge party of celebrations. But the story hasn't really ended there. For many, many years, many people have talked about the Salisbury Hall witches, and indeed the Pendle Witches. We do know through Potts's book that they were indeed tried the same day by exactly the same jury and exactly the same prosecution. However, in 1909, two very, very clever doctors met in the village of Worley, near the town of Clitheroe, in a beautiful old pub called the Worley Arms, which has now sadly gone. Dr. Whitaker and Dr. Dawson, they sat round a glowing fire, and they brought with them Thomas Potts's book, The Wonderful Discovery. And they read it from the front page to the back page. And they then decided to decipher the material. And that's when Dr. Whitaker had a brainwave. I've got it. I believe young Grace was telling the truth. How? The way she's described those dogs in the River Ribble sound a bit like Tib, Bull, Dandy. Dogs belong to young James and Alison and Elizabeth Devise. Remember, they would not have been in court that day. And she certainly wasn't in court, but she's described them perfectly. But also, let's write to York Minster and get permission to exhume the Walshman grave. They wrote to York and they met the Reverend John Franks. He had written to them and told them to be at Salisbury Church at 10 o'clock on the 9th of January, 1909. You can imagine the scene, snow on the floor, the graveyard is all white, and Reverend John Franks made his way inside the church and got the grave records and started pacing up and down the cemetery. There, gentlemen, that's where you should start digging there. Whitaker and Dawson started to dig. Just 2 feet beneath the surface, they located a lozenge-shaped child's coffin, a white coffin with metal bands across it. Under Church of England jurisdiction, the Reverend John Franks opened the coffin, and it was found to contain absolutely nothing. It seems that young Gracie may just have been telling the truth. We shall never, ever know. It's just another mystery surrounding the Pendle and Salisbury Hall witches.
It's a fascinating story, Simon. It really is, and that's the bit that got me, the years down the line when the two gentlemen dug it up and they found that the coffin was in fact empty. So it does make you wonder, in August 1612 was 10 innocent people executed and 3 guilty people let go, basically, because I'm not saying they were guilty, but as you say, that gentleman's description of the dogs, and especially the grave being empty, I think that's the biggest thing that points, towards this wee girl having told the truth. But we're running out of time, young man. I can sit and listen to you for hours. So what? Just before we wrap up, what's your favourite part of Christmas? Obviously, Christmas season is upon us, near enough. What's your
I absolutely I like Christmas Day, to be honest with you, Scott. I really, really do. Go to my daughter's house in Burnley, and my wife and I, we're going to actually cook the turkey here and take it with us as our contribution to the lunch there. But I think family is so important. I've got a 6-year-old granddaughter called Scarlett, who I think the world of. I've got a son called Guy. I've got 2 stepchildren as well from my wife's first marriage. And it's a great way for families to get together, isn't it, really? I think Christmas is a special time of year, really, Scott. Yeah.
I love Christmas. I always have. I'm roughly 8 years old. I'm not going to cover that when I say the many years I was. I'm getting on a wee bit, but I've had the lights up in the house since the day after Guy Fawkes. As soon as Guy Fawkes was done, the Christmas lights went up. It's just I think everybody's got their own. Obviously, Sarah and Whelan, we spend it here, and as you say, family and what have you. And Christmas Eve, always go to the bars in Glasgow.
Oh, yeah.
Starting to come alive again. I mean, we used to go when I was a child. My mum and dad used to take us every Christmas Eve, and we loved it. And we stayed till about 22, quarter to 12, because the later it got, the more the prices came down, basically. And we did it for years, and then I get married. I took my kids. I've just always done it. But then it died. It just seemed to die a death of ours. And I remember one Christmas Eve, I went up to Glasgow, and I don't know if you know Glasgow, or Guy Street area.
You mentioned the Barrowland. I've been there to watch a fabulous band from the 1980s called Big Country. And
I remember them.
Stuart Adamson and Big Country. And I saw them live in Barrowlands, and the acoustics in there are fantastic, aren't they, really? It's a great building, a beautiful building.
It's still there to this day. I went to see, I don't know if you remember, the Marillion in the Barrowland back in 1982, 83, I believe it was. But it used to be years ago, if you were walking up Argyle Street, as soon as you passed the Tron clock, just crossing the lights of the High Street, it was just a sea of people. It was a wall, and you were like this going round through the different stalls and that in the bars. One year I went up Christmas Eve, and there was nobody there. It was all closed up. There was about 2 or 3 stalls open, maybe at the most, and it was just so sad to see, considering the history that's been in that place. But it's the last 3-4 years it started to come alive again. So always we just buy crap. It's one of the nights of the year you buy £30-40 worth of crap, and you don't have a clue what you're going to do with it. Who am I going to give this to? And but you still buy it because it's Christmas, and you buy crap and you just go home. You know what I mean?
Of course, yeah.
But I'll keep just one last question. Are you ever coming up Scotland way again, Edinburgh and stuff like that?
Do you know something? My wife has never been to Glasgow, and we have a camper van. Would you believe? And we definitely are going to go to Glasgow next year, and I'd love to do some sightseeing because Glasgow's becoming very, very internationally famous, isn't it? Really.
It is. Well, if you've got a camper van, there's a local, it's a Park Dean resort. It's about 10-15 minutes drive from us. It's called Sundrum Castle. We go to quite a lot. It's an ideal place, for you to use as a base, basically, and they take camper vans. But Glasgow's starting to come alive again. The only thing is, we went up to the Christmas market last week, I think, Sarah and we and Laura. And we were quite disappointed. The Christmas market's in Enoch Centre. It was tight. Granted, there's not a lot of room at St Enoch's, originally, but I was just kind of disappointed. But meant to be a big Christmas market this year at the Barras, so we will be heading there on Christmas Eve. Can't wait. Love it. But I'll keep a hold of you just after we come off, Simon. So where can people find you if they're looking for you? Where can you be found?
Right, I find Facebook is probably the best way, really. Top Hat Tours, just go to Top Hat Tours, and there's a page there you can contact me, folks, really. I also have a website. No, not so much a website, but more of shall I say, an email, if you will. And that's simply Simon 413 Entwistle at btinternet.com.
Give him a look up, folks. I say we've had Simon on many times, and I would say he's a good, no offence to anyone else who does Pendle, but I would say Simon's the top man in the UK. There's nothing this guy does not know about Pendle, except where Malcolm Tower is. But nobody knows that,
Quite true.
But everything else, and check out his Tales of the Grave on YouTube as well. You will not be disappointed. But we'll wrap it up there. Big thanks to this man next door for coming. It's always a pleasure. You sit and listen to his stories for hours. We're back on Wednesday night with historian and haunted magazine writer Caroline McKendrick. And then we are out on Thursday, filming episode 4 of our Wallace Trail. and we'll get David and Craig on Thursday night. So busy week. I mean, but thanks a million, Simon, for coming on, and we'll talk to everybody soon. Take care, folks. Bye. Bye.
Bye-bye, everybody. Bye-bye.